brothers, do you recall when the grasslands reached to the horizon? And the deafening roar of countless wings overhead. Back when Rome was a village at Britain, the Emerald Island. Before we gave up on our future and buried our dead. All right, guys, let's go ahead and start. We're 2 minutes into it, and we are on episode 44, I believe. And this time we're going to talk about some things that most people don't know much about. And that, let me go back to my Zoom. And that would be the megalithic structures of Caucasus. But before we go to the megalithic structures of Caucasus, we've got to talk about some of the more interesting cultures that only became available as far as information on the archaeology of to the greater world. After the Soviet Union collapsed in about 91, 92, the world found out about these incredible and amazing finds. And so in the Caucasus region, there were very ancient cultures. It's probably after the Balkan region, it's probably the oldest known area was gold industry. It was metal industry, particularly gold, as well as regular metal. It's also one of the earliest regions in the world where iron started getting implemented and worked pretty heavily by the people there. The cult of the smith in the Caucasus, and I'm talking about Caucasus in general, is extremely, extremely central and integral. Let me go ahead and open up just some maps so you guys have kind of an idea what we're talking about. So what we're looking right now is different cultures on the territory of Caucasus. Caucasus, we've talked in the previous episodes, it's an area of extreme migrations and very early habituation by peoples in general. So what we're looking here, this is a list of various cultures. This is our Black Sea, this is the Azov Sea, this is our Caspian Sea. This is the Caucasus, the large Caucasus, the mountain range. So the cultures we're going to be talking about are going to be specifically in this order. It's going to be the Maykop culture, and that would be everything that's in red, bright red. This is Maykop, this is Maykop, this is Maykop. We're going to be talking about Koban culture, which I'm going to show you a little bit later. And we're going to be about Dolmen culture, which I'm going to show you, which is later Bronze Age. So Maykop culture starts really at the very end of the Stone Age and goes pretty far into the bronze. Well, first the bronze and then the Iron Age. It ends by the end of the Bronze Age, and then the Dolmen culture is a little bit later. It comes right after it. So let me go through some of my other maps. So this is not a very good picture. This is mostly for me. So for me is a thing. But oops. Where did I just go with this? Okay, hold on. Let me exit out of the stuff and go to my right thing. So we're going to start with the Maykop culture. Maykop culture is a pretty significant find. And when that was, stop sharing. Thank you. And so when the world found out about it, the world was quite amazed. And rather than just try to talk to you about it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you and give you just a little glimpse of what the Maykop culture is and defines. Now, this culture is very, very ancient. This is, like I said, it's one of the oldest metalworking cultures that we know was metal industry. And it was originally discovered, the Maykop kurgan, because it's a kurgan type burial, was discovered back in 1897 by a Russian explorer who was not very archaeological about the way he was doing his archaeology. But he did find amazing, amazing items. This is the Hermitage Museum. In Maykop kurgan, all these things were found. There was amazing amounts of very fine gold items. There was a lot of beads, all kinds of beads. You can see a ton of different gold items here. Workmanship of these items. I mean, all these things were found in one burial of one, most likely one leader who died, and then after he died there was a kurgan built for him, and over the kurgan later on other people buried their dead as well. So a lot of people wound up being buried there, but originally it was a burial location, of course, for one specific leader, somebody who was outstanding in the community. You see the fine workmanship on these gold pieces right here. There was weapons there. There was fine weapons there. There was and I will go show you some more very fine gold and other metals vessels for various kinds of ritual objects and things like that. A lot of gold came out of that kurgan, a lot of fine workmanship. That would be amazing, considering this was probably the end of the fourth millennia BC. So this is one. So Balkan culture was probably the oldest known gold culture in the world. And this is just the details of the ornament of some of these gold vessels and other fine vessels. There they are again. Do you see the workmanship on these things? There was bronze, a lot of bronze there. These people, they were agricultural peoples. They were settled peoples. There were a lot of animal remains found in this kurgan as well as human remains. There was a boars. There was, there was all kinds of domestic animals. The fact that there were boars there, most likely they were domesticated pigs already at this point in time was one of the indicators that they were most likely settled peoples. All of them were usually placed on their side in embryo position, usually on river terraces was where they were buried. These burials, this culture, the Maykop culture, and I'll show you the map here in a minute, was spread very widely because once this culture was identified and started being compared to other cultures in the surrounding regions, it turned out that it was so widespread that some people tried to break it up into not a culture, but a community or commonality.
These amongst the very first settled farmers, they must have been pretty close.
Yes, these finds are from about the end of the 4th millennium, pretty early on. This is about, I mean, some of these are contemporary with the Sumerian civilization. Now here are the fine gold figures that everybody covets in this culture, and other metal figures. That these were toppings for like for staffs. You can see the, and I have some more closer pictures of it, but these figurines is something that you would probably see today in a museum. I mean, you buy somewhere in a museum store. I mean, these are so finely crafted, so lifelike, very, very amazing stuff. So when this was discovered, this was quite a sensation. You can see these rams. They have all kinds of animals there. They have lion figures because obviously in that time, lions still existed in the Caucasus. They went extinct relatively recently in our terms. These people were very advanced. They had this amazing gold work. And they, you know, and another thing that is unique about the Maykop culture, we'll be talking about another culture, the Koban culture, that was kind of contemporary with this one. This culture was mostly focused on gold items and also stone workmanship, but they also had the potter's wheel. And out of that region, they're the only culture that had the potter's wheel. And once it disappeared, so did the potter's wheel from the region for quite a long time. There's also some writing associated with this culture. I'm not going to go into very deep discussion with because there's only one item, one plate was writing, and it has not been deciphered. There's a lot of speculation about what it means. The one gentleman who deciphered it from the Abkhazian Republic, he used the modern Abkhazian language to decipher something that was, you know, 4,000 years before our era, and a lot of people think that what he deciphered is nonsense. So it's kind of one of those. And he insists on it. A lot of other people think that he's just crazy. He was quite a renowned linguist before he did this, but he has since admitted. Well, he hasn't admitted to falsification, but it's obvious that he has in fact falsified some things. We don't know a lot about these people. This is obviously before written culture. This is not much is known about how they live their lives other than what we have from our archaeological sources. And I'm just rushing through these cultures very quickly. So here's the map of the area of the spread of the Maykop culture. So you see this Caucasus Yamnai culture, we were talking about those peoples when we were talking about the foundation of the Indo-European peoples, of the steppes peoples. So that's the Yamnai culture right here. And Maykop, that's where the first kurgan was found, but their area of spread is about this big, which is pretty significant if you look at it. And later on, towards the end of that culture, they intermixed with the neighboring Yamnai culture, and they formed a whole new, different commonality. This is another. This is just regional map, but this is the Maykop again is here, and this is the area of Krasnoyarsk and so forth, just some maps. So Maykop culture, it is the oldest people. We don't know much about them. They did have settled agriculture, and they also had already domesticated animals. They had stone tools. They had very well done stone tools in the beginning of the 3rd century before our era. They even found some Egyptian amulets in these burials. There was some skeletal remains found in the original kurgan, male skeletons. He was buried in a very elaborate burial. So this is original kurgan, what it looks like, what was found. So each one of these, there's a series of these kurgans. The original complex consists of 5 kurgans, and there is a local legend that there were 5 brave legendary brothers who got slain there, and each one of them, of these legendary warriors, got buried in their own burial mound. Within each of these kurgans, they would find these fine gold items, and here are some close-ups of these items here. There's a lion. You can see that there's a range of different decorative matters. This is, you can see also the scenes on here. Interesting thing, do you see this double mountain right here with rivers coming down? These have been pretty much by archaeologists attached to specific locations within that neighborhood. There's a boar detail of the ornament. There's some fine, this is, finely made metal things. These are finely crafted stone bracelets and so forth. Some more very fine vessels. Again, birds, mountains, a lot of subtopic. I mean, very widespread of subjects that their ornaments seem to have covered. This is also an ornament. These are these really beautiful. So they're small. They're basically the tops for staffs or tops for some sort of ceremonial items. But that's why they have a hole in the middle of them. But they're made out of bronze. They're made out of all kinds of interesting stuff. So that's the Maykop culture. I'm going to stop for a second, see if anybody has anything they want to say.
I have a bit of a question, actually. It's about what kind of tools did they find for the metalworking?
We will talk a little bit about it. We're going to, one of these episodes, we're going to probably next one, we're going to talk about the Narts, the epic cycle about the Narts. Narts is the name for all of the Caucasian peoples, regardless of whether they are from Georgia, Abkhazia, if they are from Chechen Republic, or if they're from Dagestan, if they're from Adygea. They all share variations of the Nartic epic tales. And as a matter of fact, there's a pretty good hint that even the Sarmatian Scythian population that was contemporary with these peoples also shared the same epic tales. And these are a series of epic folk tales about heroic. They're not humans, and they're predecessors of humans, those greater than, Chris, I think you would have a better idea of what I'm talking about. They're greater than life, gigantic, enormous, powerful creatures that
they're heroes.
Yeah, they're epic heroes. That's right. Just in American culture, there's not really such a thing as it's in Native American culture, obviously there is, but
yeah, Paul Bunyan, people like that, they're sort of larger than life. They probably existed, but things have been added to them over the years, so they become heroes.
Right. So this is so I'm going to share with you now the other culture that was contemporary with these peoples was the Koban culture. And Koban, both of these were not really high up. They were mostly, let me share this with you real quick. Yeah, they were mostly in the valleys. So all of these cultures were mostly in the valleys. So the Koban culture was very different. They are amazing because even though their burials are not so rich as far as gold and all those beautiful ornaments go, they are rich in something else. This is the end of Bronze time, end of the second, beginning of the first millennia before our era in the North Caucasus and Ossetia, for example. But here they were doing metal work very early on, working with actual iron. Moreover, their iron had additives of arsenic early on, and it had additives of nickel early on. So these also, you can see that obviously they were horsemen. The horsemanship was very heavily involved. These were people who were pretty closely intermixing with the steppes peoples nearby. Their metallurgy was very rare. Their bronze, first of all, was amazing. I mean, these are some, I'll show some of the, so yeah, so it had additives of lead. It had additives that did not appear again officially until 18th century. They had very elaborate decorative items. They did inlays on bronze. These are like, for example, they're hanging decorations that basically pendants and so forth, or other decorative hanging items. So these are imitation. You can see some of their, obviously horses very, very important in their culture. They were definitely more valley people. Adygea, and we will talk about the Republic of Adygea and Adygea peoples, which are very unique peoples. Also people of Ossetia. I mean, a lot of people have a lot in common. This is closer up of the same horse. You can see how fine of an ornament this is. They had interesting figurines like that. These are various decorative, they had a lot of these things everywhere. This is obviously like a fibula. This is, for example, you see little birds on there. This is a necklace of birds. The horse, elements of horse equipment. Very fine little figurines like that. There's a lot of rams, a lot of goats. You see this is a ram-shaped decorative item also. So they had a lot of very interesting decorative stuff as well. So after that, after these people were starting to already decline, that's when the megalithic culture appeared. Okay, so the Dolmen culture, as it is known, is really all over the Caucasian mountains. I mean, it's all across the Western Caucasus. It's all across the Northern Caucasus. It's in Abkhazia. It's everywhere. This is the little markers here is where different dolmens have been found. Now, you got to understand, everybody knows what a dolmen is, right? It's a little house. It's basically a box that's traditionally, dolmen is a box that's made out of 4 plates with a 5th one on top with a roof. They're usually very heavy stones. I mean, up to 10-ton. Individual stone plates, but they usually form a house. This now dolmen culture is part of the megalithic culture of the world in general. I mean, these are some. This is a map of where the megalithic culture has been found across the world. Of course, the largest number of these culture was found in Europe, particularly in Britain, in Germany, in Ireland, and so forth. Also, but these are found all across the world. They are found in Asia. They are found in Africa. So I'm just want to go about the history. And so once we start talking about the dolmens and the megalithic culture of Caucasus, we can first compare it to what's happening in Europe. So I'm starting with Europe. So this right here, for example, is in Britain. This is an old megalithic structure. This is a dolmen, what a dolmen looks like, except here a house has been built next to a dolmen that's being used as a barn. It's one of the very quaint examples. Here's some images. This is not a dolmen, but this is, well, it's a dolmen technically, but Caucasian ones don't look like that. Some of them are these big. These are some engravings of what they look like. This is a French one, for example. Here's and yet another one. Some of them look war up on the hills. Now, there are different variations. I'm not going to go into terminology of it, but some of them are square, some of them are round. Some of them are closed in, some of them are open. Some of them are built in whole cities of dolmens. For example, in Caucasus, what we will see are examples of individual dolmens. Well, in reality, but there's an individual dolmen left now. There are up to 100 of them left. Here's another one, again, an engraving. People really like these. They were very picturesque. So there was a lot of engravings. Now, this is also Europe, but this is what known as menhirs, and these are cities, sometimes very large cities up to 5,000, sometimes just a few, of standing stones that are believed to be intended to be anthropomorphic. This is in Britain. It's a very famous location. I think there's 5,000 of them there, something like that. So we're just going about history of Europe. Here's again, this is what's called the corridor burial. This is probably, if I remember right, this is from Britain. But these were also, it's again, this is an engraving from 19th century, late 18th century. This is Ethiopia. These are again menhirs, standing stones. They're usually, sometimes they have engravings on them and various other ornaments. This right here is, for example, in Asia. So this is somewhere in Asia. So these are literally found all over the world. Although, I mean, they're found everywhere. So these have been considered pretty much holy sites, kind of sacred sites. Since they were first discovered, people have always been very curious about this. This is an example of one being incorporated into a church.
I'll give you a little break here, Julie. Now, the reason that I was asking about metalwork, and maybe David or somebody else knows a little bit about this, it seems like we have a lot of good artifacts of extremely fine metalwork, but I don't often see a lot of the tooling that was used, such as the hammers, chisels, that type of thing. I mean, were they made out of iron alloys and did they simply rust away, or are they just disregarded more? I don't know.
Most of the stonework actually became before metal was used. So they would use things like antler picks. Like in England, there's you find a lot of antlers buried near where the stonework is found. So it was basically hard work, stone against stone, a harder stone against softer stone, antlers and things like that. They didn't use a lot of metal in their work.
First off, in the Stone Age, the late Neolithic, they got to using polished stone a lot. And then they kind of moved to copper at the same time, keeping most of the polished stone and that kind of thing. Most of that was the early of the artwork that she showed earlier was of the early Bronze Age. And that's interesting. There's some parallels with the early Peruvian civilizations, which were also mountainous. At the time of the Spanish came, they were on the verge of an arsenic, copper, Bronze Age. bronze can be made with arsenic instead of tin. But yeah, I think those 3,700 to 3,000 BC, which was that first culture, would be about the early Bronze Age. Most of the tools would either been stone or bronze themselves, I would imagine.
Well, the reason that I thought it was a little bit curious is because at that level of metalworking, like what Julie showed us with the gold work and the bronze work, these look like works that would have been at least partly made with metallic tools that were made of metal themselves.
Okay, so to answer your question, Ryan, I just pulled up actually another presentation on this very subject. Now, there's an interesting association in the Caucasus. I'm jumping a little bit ahead, but since we're on the subject, that a lot of these dolmens were associated location-wise. So they would find one of these Caucasian dolmens, and within the dolmen itself, within the structure, in the openings or whatever, near it, around it, or in the rock pile on top of it, for example, or across the river, sometimes wherever there was a running water nearby, there would be a forge. So these things seem to be associated with forge. So oftentimes within the dolmens themselves, there would be smith buried, and what you see right there are shellac from iron production. It was a highly prestigious and extremely magical, of course, throughout the world, it was a very magical skill to be able to take rocks and turn them into something amazing. But there's a real correlation between the location of, in multiple locations, they would literally find the burial of a smith, and next to it, they would find actual forge and some sort of a running water, which of course was required for the forge, and they would put these things in the in the dolmens themselves as offerings. Now, this is an interesting correlation when we're going to be talking about the Nart epic cycle. I just want you guys to see how they're incorporated within the stones and everything else placed around the dolmens. Now, these dolmens, there's a lot of questions about these. People like to attach different meanings to these things that's just not real. But people talk about them being portals in space. People talk about stuff. But here's back to my original presentation. Again, I said this place is a holy. So now we're actually moving on to the actual Caucasian. Caucasus is different, and we're going to go through we have a lot of images to talk about, a lot of things to talk about. So we saw some of the examples from Europe, right? Now, this is ornaments details. Some of these, not a lot, but some of these, both in Europe and in Caucasus, they have ornaments. Some of them, for example, are made to look like the wood buildings in Europe in particular. That's available. Here you see portal. Now, the Caucasian dolmens always have a small round portal. There's another legend associated with that, and we will talk about it towards the end a little bit more, but it's also part of the Nart thing. Some of them have ornaments, not very often, but they will have interesting engravings. Some of them, both in Europe and in Caucasus, will have, for example, sometimes arrows and bows. Sometimes they will have knives or swords engraved in them. These openings that are meant to have plugs. Now, you got to remember, when these structures were originally built, they were usually built for a specific character. They were built for a specific leader or somebody who was highly honored, an elder. So one person usually was buried in it. Maybe one person was his immediate association. But over the centuries, because these things were so enigmatic, people would open them and first bury their family members near in the same structures. Then they would bury other important peoples. Then other peoples would move into the area. See, there's another image of the plug. So every time you see one of these dolmens with these openings, or if you see a large opening, just remember, originally it looks something like this. The portal or the opening usually points towards the sunrise most often. Usually the front of the dolmen is polished or decorated, but the sides oftentimes were buried in a pile of stones. There's a plug that's, they didn't actually do a plug, but they indicated a plug in this one. So these, remember we were looking at the menhirs in the European region. Well, there's some menhirs also in the region of Caucasus that are debated by scientists whether or not they're actually menhirs, but I just found some people's photos from just traveling across various areas of Caucasus. This is actually Crimea. So see these women's breasts right here? Those are ornaments that are sometimes found on these kind of gates. Some of them actually, they found they look exactly like houses. Now, there are different types of dolmens you will find in Caucasus. Some of them, like the one here, is made out of plates. So it has 1, 2, 3 back plate and then one on top. That's the most standard type. Sometimes if you have a dolmen that's been literally carved out of one single piece of rock like this one. Some of them will have seating areas like that, and it is believed that it's possible that either the relatives or the people of the tribe who was saying goodbye to the deceased would sit there and feast, or possibly that the body of the deceased person was placed there for mummification or other such purposes. These are different types of dolmens from across the world. I'm just going to go through. This is a French type, French again. This is Germanic. In Germany, you often have just a one big stone on top of like balanced on top of other stuff. This right here is in Palestine. They oftentimes piled out of many things. Again, Palestine, the typical one. This is in Georgia, India, Switzerland, and in Siberia. So these are literally all across the world. I mean, these are found all over the world. Now, some are complex dolmens, like this one, where you have many smaller rocks. And see, this one used to have many pile, like it used to have an architectural ornament or like a structure around it. Some of them had long corridors of stones laid out or were covered in piles of stones. Another one that's carved out of one single piece of rock. Now, you got to understand, these little openings people had to get in and put the deceased people into. Now, the legend in the Nartian epic, it's not really a part of the Nart epic story, but it's kind of around it. So the people of Caucasus used to believe that there were giants who lived in their mountains, and there were also little people. And so the giants in their epic stories are very not pleasant. They're multi-headed, they are not nice, they're kind of stupid. They're not really seen as, neither one of those characters is seen as evil or good, they're just seen as other peoples. So the giants lived there, and then there was the little peoples that lived there, and they believed that those little peoples, they used to ride hares, rabbits. And that's the reason why rabbits move the way they do now, is because they still have their legs tied together by invisible bonds. And that's why they cop like a horse would when their legs are tied together. And they believe that the little peoples used to ride these hares, and that so later generations of Caucasian peoples, they said they thought that maybe these were the houses that the giants built for the little people, and that these openings were just big enough for the hare and the little person on top of the rider to jump inside this home. And this is you see this is a dolmen. The opening is over here, but these are seed carved out seeds for it. They use, I mean, there's hundreds of these all over Caucasus. Another one was a portal. They see this one has a wall going around, and some of them were in alleys. Another one carved out of a whole rock. Another one that's kind of put together. You see how perfect these round holes oftentimes are. People like to think of these things that there's, I don't know, magical spatial radiation reception centers or acoustic generators. During Russian Civil War, machine gunners would oftentimes hide inside of these and hold the fort, so to speak, until they ran out of bullets. That's also known. Another one right here, very beautiful one. Obviously been somewhat restored. This is another one that's been acculturated, but you see where there's the top fell off, but there's still that opening there. Some of them, like I said, this is one that has the whole complex around it still. We saw somewhat earlier. This is some of the menhirs, again in the forests. Sometimes in North Caucasus, you will see ones that look just like the ones in Germany when you have a plate that's just kind of with openings in between. Though in Caucasus, usually they're very tightly built. It seems like people wanted them to be very closed off.
Well, it's another question, really, but I heard a mention of the hole. It does usually face towards the sun. I mean, in the northern hemisphere, did they typically go south?
Yeah, it's usually sunrise. Usually sunrise, wherever that is.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm trying to get to the present.
The Bronze Age before, when they in England, when they built the roundhouses, they also had the doors facing the sunrise. So that would be a common thing.
But it's really interesting, what's interesting in the Caucasus, first of all, they seem to be much more prominent than, that seems to be something that people in general were just very much obsessed with and did a lot of. But their solutions that they found, if they didn't have big plates, they found little ones. But it seems like they were really obsessed with, hold on, I'm trying to pause this thing real quick so I can show you this really interesting excavation. If they didn't have if they didn't have big stones, they would go with little stones. If they didn't have either, they would, as long as they could find stone, they would build these things. And later on, even when they couldn't find stone, they still tried to build them one way or another. And it's just, people came up with all kinds of solutions. Variety of these, on the one hand, they're very varied. On the other hand, they're very similar. Here's the interesting thing about these things. People argue, some people would say that they may have been some sort of I don't know what you would call it, industrial locations where people did some sort of projects or use them as, I don't know, as buildings for manufacture of some stuff or another. But in reality, there's almost always burial complexes associated with these. Sometimes up to 70 people can be buried within one structure. So this is Janet's group. Janet is a French explorer. So I'm just going to let these run through. Some of them have very elaborate decorations. See again, that portal that imitates wood beams. Oops. Some of them had additional kind of weird buildings. So some of them were like that. This is a little bit less typical type. Oftentimes the stones that were placed around these things, later on people would take away for construction. So what you wind up with would be bare, alone standing dolmen. But in reality, in its original composition, they can tell that it was surrounded by an alley. Sometimes they had portals in front of them. There's another one carved out of a whole stone, but you see how there's a whole complex of these.
I have a question. In England, the dolmens are generally, originally they were all covered in earth, and the earth is now worn away, exposing them. Is there evidence that these ones were covered with earth as well?
They were definitely covered with something. More often than not, it was stones. But yeah, that is also the case here oftentimes. You see, some of them will have like little structures in front of them like that, for example. What they were for, we're not sure. But like when this one, the courtyard is reconstructed, but the little garden that would have been over here, it hasn't been. Nowadays, they of course are all protected. But they're all very valued. I mean, there are tourist attractions. I mean, people travel all over the place to look at these. This is, again, says archaeology memorial. There's the plug, you can see it very well. But these were obviously done with great love. You can see how tightly these are built. The Caucasian ones, they wanted them very enclosed. In some peoples in Siberia, for example, to this day, to the beginning of the 20th century, there was a tradition of feeding the dead. I'm sure that's also the same in the native peoples as well. Sometimes in some places of the world, the burials would happen in such a way that the head of the deceased person would be above the ground so that the people could come and feed the deceased person. With the whole satellite imagery, they've been able to find also something that was very similar to hedges, circles in the Caucasus all over the place. I mean, there are some places where fields, I mean, not up in the mountains, but in the valleys closer and, you know, the bottoms of the mountains, they're just covered with these circles that were obviously some sort of hedges that were very similar to Stonehenge. So it is pretty obvious that this kind of megalithic culture that was so endemic, I mean, all over from Europe to Africa, that it went as far as the Caucasus, and where it started, nobody knows. Unfortunately, we don't have no writing is left from these people, why they were building these things. It is obvious that to build one of these structures, you would have to have quite a few people. Now, there have been some experiments by Russian scientists where they tried moving these plates, and about 20 people or so with rollers can move, you know, 2-ton plate more or less. But an interesting thing, when this dolmen culture started kind of going down towards when start to see how they're just everywhere. When it started winding down, they find some interesting things where they can see that the dolmen was being constructed, but the plate and all the plates have been moved to build the dolmen horizontally on the mountain side. But then one of the plates slid down, and it looked like they didn't have enough manpower anymore to push it back up the hill, so they would just leave it there and leave the structure unfinished. So it seems like people who were building these hung on to this tradition long after they were already pretty much assimilated, long after a whole new peoples came in, new burial practices. And moreover, these structures continued to be used almost to the end of the 19th century. I mean, they still, to a point, they're still constructed today. Again, by today, I mean the end of the 20th century. And actually in Japan, as recently as just a little while ago, they were being constructed all for some nobility. I mean, I think 17th century. Yeah, this is when they were trying to move. See, this is people's trying to move at that.
Also, I have to admit, the dedication to that type of burial memorial does remind me of something that I saw on Interstate 70, and it was tucked away in a canyon. But somebody put a lot of work into simply building a memorial for a fallen worker. Maybe this dedication was basically about dedicating a monument to heroes, basically.
That's of course, definitely. And you know, and there's some supposition that possibly how this whole thing began may have been that this is one of the theories that maybe when people lived in the caves, you know, in the mountains, that possibly when they needed to bury somebody, they had to Some of these excavated, they look like actually like they have sloped, let me out of this. They have sloped roofs, so they are built like houses, and they actually have like wood rafters and even like supporting beams that represent what would have been a wooden structure, but it's done in stone. And when those were first discovered, some of the earlier ones, other archaeologists was saying that that's not possible, or that they don't come in that kind of, dollhouse sort of shape. Well, they do.
Also about Japan, there's on Okinawa, there's something that they call turtleback tombs. There's just something to look into later.
Right. And once we get to that, we're going to talk more about it. Now, I just wanted to show you just one last interesting, this is called Koliho stone. Koliho is a location. They heard that the dolmen has been washed out by the river, and the archaeologists were lucky to where they got to it pretty early, and they started excavating it, and it has actually been undisturbed by people. It's been disturbed by the river, and some of the walls fell over, but the burials were intact. They found about 70 people buried in that particular dolmen. You can imagine how stuffed they were in there. But on the side of one of the side walls inside the dolmen, they found this amazing thing. Now I'll show you what it looks like from the outside, but this is what it looks like. If you look up close to it, you can see that there's a circle right here. That's a circle. What you have here is something that's kind of shaped like a moon, something like shaped like a star, and it has 12 partitions around the edges. You can't see them very well here, but and then there is symbols. So this seems to be something that may have been used by early agriculturalists to determine the sun up, sundown, and the times of the season for planting things. I mean, this is, but it's so understandable to modern. David is jumping in, so I'm going to silence for a second.
I think there's a lot of universality here, just in the rock shelters of our earliest ancestors. And there's different forms. There's the roundhouses like in Ireland and England. There's the circles that are the Stonehenge being the most famous of them, but there's some bigger ones in Brittany and various places like that. And the freestanding stones. And often they take, I think part of the reason they're so common in the Caucasus is because stone was available pretty close. But sometimes out in the steppe even, people will drag stones to set up, and that carried on even into Hunnic times. Yeah, I think there's just something about stones that big stones like that call to us, probably because we did live in caves and rock shelters and things like that. And even in North America, you get the big rock circles. So I don't know. I think there's a commonality there.
Well, psychologically, I think, David, it may just carry on, because my own family has basically done the same thing. We hauled a big honking piece of granite up to bury the dog that was my best friend, and bury him on a hill. It may just be something that we do traditionally.
Yeah, speaking of universality, and it's very interesting how Tolkien has taken this history and into modern folklore as the hobbits and the home of the hobbits.
I want to show you where they find these are the bones inside the dolmen. I mean, there's people are packed in there very, very tightly. You can see. It's like it was originally one person burial, and then after a while, they start more and more people. Different cultures would move in, but they would continue using, because these were status locations. They would become almost like sacred sites. There would be a lot of burials around each individual dolmen. There would be burials all around it. So there would be first this high status person, then his family, then a bunch of other people from the society, and then eventually other cultures would just bury their dead around there, just because they knew it was a sacred place, basically. But right here is what I want to get to, is the disc. Yeah, that's what this disc looks like right here. See, it's perfectly round, and it's very flat. It's very finely crafted. It's very finely crafted, and you can see. So on the one side, it had it's been laying there for so long that the shape of the stones around it imprinted on it. But once they washed it on the other side, they had this star, and moon shapes, and they were quite amazed. I mean, it's very, very unique, and it's very, very fine craftsmanship. It was obviously placed there quite intentionally. Yeah, by the way, these were built mostly, of course, of sandstone, limestone, things like that. So fine grained sandstone, so it would still be firm, but it would be easy to work with. So that's pretty much what I wanted to present today. And these dolmens, by the way, they play a really huge part. And by the way, the dolmens, what Ryan was asking about as far as the metallurgy goes, and the tools for the metallurgy, and the magic associated with metallurgy of all kinds, you know, from gold work to bronze to, of course, well, copper and bronze, then to iron. These things are very much embedded in the legends and the folklore and the epic stories of the peoples. There's cycle about the Narts, and I'm going to kind of introduce that cycle before we do it the next episode. And then after that, I want to start going through some of the more, well, larger communities. If I leave anybody out of the Caucasian peoples, it's because, not because you are not important, it's just because there's so much to tell about each and every individual peoples, and there's so many different peoples. I just may not be not knowledgeable on all the different peoples that exist, but I'm going to try to cover as many different peoples as I can with their variety. But this Nart epic story, it's very unique. It's a world heritage, and it's particular to all the Caucasian peoples, regardless of what their origin, what their language, or what their current religious beliefs are. So the Narts,
They came after the cultures you were.
Yeah, well, they came out of the cultures we're talking about, because a lot of these elements, for example, when I was talking about the smith and being buried in some of these dolmens and having a forge nearby, you know, what people used to do back then, they would find a rock, and it looks like a rock. I mean, to people of Stone Age, it was probably a rock, but then when they would split it, they would take out the fine ore inside. Well, for example, the Nart legends have the fine tales about one of the greater Narts, because Narts are not gods. They are the ancestors. They're people greater than people. They're the giants. They're the heroes. They're the people, you know, they kind of partially Greek titans, because, for example, the mythos of Prometheus seems to take its origin in the Nartic epic cycle. For example, the idea of Achilles. Achilles' story was the heel, seems to have at least be related to, possibly take its origin in some of the Nartic epic stories, because very similar tales. I mean, a lot of those Greek mythical stories that we know very well, they actually echo very closely with the Caucasian epic stories. And in Caucasus, these were epic stories. They were not about gods. Now, in Greek culture, they became about gods. But interesting thing about the Nartic epic cycle is that, just like in most worldviews, like when we were talking about shamanism, there's of course 3 layers to reality, right? You have your underworld, you have your world, and then you have the above world, the heavens, whatever you want to call it. Well, in a lot of these epic stories, for example, in the Russian epic style story, the hero, the main central hero, may go down to the underworld, and he may go up. Sometimes she may go up to the overworld. Well, Narts are not allowed to do either. The underworld is known about, it exists, but it's never mentioned. It's just not talked about. And the overworld is explicitly in these stories. If the Narts even try to go up to the overworld, that's damnation, death, and doom. So it's kind of almost like the tale of Tower of Babylon. There's one of the Nartic tales where the heroes try to reach the heavens, and they kind of climb upon each other and everything else, and they almost get there, and they have the links of a cat's tail left after they already piled everything on top of each other. And it's the idea of, it's kind of like how fast can a turtle move to outrun the hare in the Greek idea, to where you have increasingly small increments, but you will never quite get there. It's kind of like chasing the horizon. So these epic heroes, they're very unique, they're very endemic, and they have left enormous influence across the epic cycles around that region and the world. Obviously, again, Sarmatian, Scythian epic cycle, because those tribes, those peoples were so intermixed between the steppes and the mountains above them. There was a lot of clashes, a lot of intermarriages. The Maykop culture that we talked about in the beginning of this episode, for example, later on mixed, particularly with the steppe culture, to form a whole new, different, unique culture. And even the Dolmen culture seems to have faded under the waves. It seems like waves of people kept coming up from the steppes, from the surrounding valleys up into the mountains, and each successful wave would push the other peoples up and up and up and up, building this almost like a layering of different cultures and ethnic groups who would all intermix and then be split out into different valleys, into different areas in the mountains. And that's why the Caucasus is so unique in its repository of some of the oldest beliefs, some of the oldest traditions, some
connections to northern Syria too.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's a lot like Afghanistan in that way, and it's a lot like some areas of India, for example. The Basques in the mountains, in Scotland in the mountains. Oftentimes, you have the older cultures echoing and reverberating through time, and that's why these areas are so very important in our anthropological, archaeological, cultural studies, big ethnographic studies, because they can teach us a lot about the history of humanity, and they preserve those very unique, very old, and very central to every human being traditions. That's pretty much what I wanted to say today.
Well, scaling a mountain or bringing a rock off of a mountain, that would have been a pretty epic feat, I would imagine, in those cultures. And I think that that is carried on. I actually, for some reason, remembered the legend of the Siberian people and the shaman Morgan Kara, and how there was punishment struck down upon him for going up to the heavenly god and taking back a soul that had been taken, and his drum was struck in half. So there was a lot of danger associated with probably going up, same as going down.
Right. And, and a lot of this, once you start looking, I'm just going through some of the pictures real quick again, just so that people have a chance to look at these. I mean, a lot of these legends, it's funny how much they echo across the world, no matter whether you're in the New World, Australia is a little bit a land of its own, but even it has some of the different, this is different dolmens across the world. They go again from India to Asia to Middle East. There's some, these megalithic structures where people put together an effort. And it seems like the purpose to me, people don't know why people build these enormous structures. Some of these stones weigh up to 10 tons or more. But it seems like the reason why people did these enormous tasks is because it was when the culture was still learning how, people were going from living in very small family tribal groups to living in very much larger societies. And I think that the idea of uniting together in order to perform a very difficult task is people who built those were still hunter and gatherers. See, and again, this shows all over the place. This little bits here, a little bits here, Madagascar, Japan. India, it's everywhere. China, Korea, everywhere you find these, again, the spread of the Dolmens across the Caucasus. You can see they're all over the place. So it seems that people came together to do these tasks together. People were almost like practicing what it's like to be a society that is something that's very simple to us today, how to act in unison, how to act in cohesion, how to deal with larger than 200, maybe more people around you when you're used to living in smaller family groups of no more than maybe 30, 35, 40 people. It's the ability to move together. I'm sure that music, that chanting, that rituals, that rhythm had a lot to do with it. When people learn how to work and sing, how to work as a team, how to accept others, so many peoples around them. And I think those joint efforts, it was almost like practice, because people did this all over the world and then they stopped. It's almost as if humanity was trying to learn how to work together as a team. David is jumping in, so I'm going to silence for a second, guys.
I had an archaeology professor 30 years ago. He used to say that all the major temples and walls and many of those things were to keep the children off the streets, to have a project to entertain people and keep in mind these societies are starting to develop social hierarchies, but they're still pretty wild peoples. So giving them something to do was maybe not a bad idea if you happen to be the chief or the priest or whatever.
That's pretty funny, David, because I think that echoes into modern society. Keep the kids busy and give them social cohesion, and they'll figure it out as they get older.
That partially answers the question of what is religion, one of the aspects, right? I mean, part of the function of any religion in the world has always been to bring that cohesion, to unite people together in a common task, whether it's building a pyramid for the pharaoh so that the whole generation was the pharaoh could move forward into the afterlife. I mean, a lot of people don't understand.
Different from shamanism.
Yeah, it's very different from shamanism. So, you know, in shamanism, it's much more individualistic. It's much more smaller unit. But for example, like a lot of people don't understand. People think that the ancient Egyptians built the pyramids because everybody slaved away to try to get their pharaoh great afterlife. That's not true at all. What was happening there is when the pharaoh moved on to the afterlife, the entire generation that lived with him, he took it all with him. The whole kingdom moved on into the afterlife. So the people of Egypt, they were not slaving to glorify their ruler, they were slaving to glorify themselves. That's why it was such a, you know, they had competitive teams in there. That's why people put so much. You cannot force a whole country full of thousands and, you know, hundreds of thousands of peoples by any sort of nature, force of or anything to put all of their time, all of their effort into this one huge construction, such as the Giza pyramids, for example. So it was, to them, it was important, was that cohesion activity. We're all together, we're going to move into the afterlife. The pharaoh took the whole country, his whole time. It's almost like a snapshot of his people with him or her in some cases. And I think that's what religion has done, whether it was Egyptian religion, but by the time we had a big agricultural society where people, even big hunter and gatherer society, when there was a lot of people running around everywhere and they were running into each other quite regularly now, rather than just once in a blue moon. I think that idea of being able to do something together as a unit became a very important thing. Keeping the kids off the street, like David said, keeping people from having conflict with each other, teaching people how to be peaceful, how to work together towards a common goal rather than butting heads, as we see what's happening around the world all over right now, when we return back to the idea of individualism and individual interest, individual profit, individual future. When that cohesion, social cohesion falls apart is when you have conflicts like the unfortunate one that we're dealing with right now.
Yeah, there are examples in the modern day where it still happens. I know in Newfoundland, when a couple gets married, the couple provides the lumber, but the town gets together to build them a house. And there are barn raisings among especially religious communities and things like that. So there's cohesion of acting as a group together. We still do that today in some places.
Well, and it's a wonderfully safe place for a culture to practice cohesion and to get together is practicing, if you will, practicing gratitude. And you're practicing gratitude for those who have come before you, you're practicing gratitude for your culture, what you've learned, what you've been given. And it's a very safe place for a culture to conjoin together.
Absolutely. You know, my mom used, and it's also safe in another sense. My mom used to say back in the day that, you know, if you get depressed or upset, don't go to a psychologist, don't go to a psychiatrist. Fill a tub full of hot water. Take a couple pairs of jeans and, you know, bed sheets and just start washing. By the time you're done with that laundry, you ain't going to be upset. You ain't going to be depressed. You ain't going to be anything else. You're going to be dead tired. And I think in that sense, what David was saying also falls in, because once you get done moving that huge megalithic plate, yeah, you're not going to have time for war, conflict. You're all just ready to go. Food, sleep, you know. And,
yeah,
let's have a beer. You want one too?
Yeah, and you know, you did that with your neighbor.
Right, and you got to know each other. You got to know their qualities. You got to know them more than just a warrior, just a hunter. You got to know what they were like to work with, right? So.
Can I say something?
Of course.
Also, buildings are also, especially religious buildings, I call them like focal points of meditation. You know, that's a collective concentration of meditative activity can happen inside the building as well.
Especially, yeah, and David just reminded me of something, the pyramids, we were just talking about the pyramids in Egypt. There is a rumor that in one part of Caucasus, there once upon a time stood almost like a 12-meter tall pyramid made out of separate stones that locals just disassembled. It was basically a dolmen, but it was a dolmen that was composite and made in a pyramidal form that before archaeologists could get to it, locals just took apart for construction purposes. I mean, throughout the centuries, not just at any recent time. And another interesting thing to that idea of social cohesion, sometimes you will have a dolmen, right, that's constructed of several stones, and those stones will have some sort of ornament on it. For example, a picture of a bull or several bulls. Well, what archaeologists have found, sometimes there will be neighboring dolmens, and you will find one plate with the bull's head on one, and the plate with the bull's tail in the other one, right? So it's the idea of this communal property, of these ideas getting shared, recycled, reused in construction. And this happens to today's to today. I've showed some pictures where churches incorporated dolmens even in their architecture. The idea of the sacred bits of pieces, they're moving around. That's why ancient Gothic, so not ancient, but like Middle Ages Gothic constructions would get taken apart and turned into mosques, then taken apart, turned into churches. Houses would get built out of Colosseum stones and so forth. It's this idea that community, humanity, cultures, they're all intermingled, they're all one. And that's something I think would be really good to remember for the world today, I think. So, yeah.
Oh, I was going to say, thank you, by the way, for all the amazing images, because I have never seen anything like that before. That was very impressive, but it really does show the dedication. And, well, we all have our own hypothesis, but social cohesion and bonding, and what was the community actually putting their energy into? They were trying to basically probably
be constructive.
They were trying to form a union about something that a larger community could actually get into, and honoring the dead, well, that was probably a very good idea.
And just before I finish, I just want to finish with this thought. You know, there's some valleys where there's up to 700 of these dolmens within one valley. And that's after bulldozer drivers ran them over in the 60s. It's after locals took them apart for centuries for construction projects, after fields got plowed. But these are up in Caucasian mountains, right? Oftentimes on hard to reach slopes or forested areas. And this is what's left after the centuries and centuries of destruction. Imagine how many of these covered the entire European, Eurasia, Africa. Before the agriculturists came and they tore them down to make their fields, before the plows went over back and forth these stone circles, and they knocked down these buildings. I mean, the whole continent, several continents were covered, absolutely covered with these amazing, enormous buildings, and the wonderment in which those peoples must have lived in. When you just a hunter-gatherer or just barely early agriculturist, you live in a hut, I mean a small house, and you see these enormous, Greeks called them cyclopic buildings. I mean, you lived among the gods, you lived among the giants. No wonder people saw these images, they believed in these images, they lived in this world of magic. It was very real to them. So it's a wonder that we could imagine now that we think back of how the world must have looked so very different to the people before it all became civilized. All right, guys. So next one I would like to do on the Nart epic cycle, and then just move on to, because we kind of need to have the basics of these cultures and the Nart cycle, how it grows from these cultures before we move on to more modern peoples.
If just very briefly before we go to Ryan, I would love at some point to hear the story of your pup and that ceremony. And a while back, long time ago, mid-90s, there was a fellow that I worked for, and he's up in northeastern Wyoming. His name was Gene, and he had this Swiss mountain dog named Bear. Huge dog, beautiful dog, and the love of his life. And Bear passed away, and it was mid-February, and Gene wanted to bury Bear on top of a mountaintop. And so we go up to, not mountaintop, hilltop. So we go up to this hilltop to start to try to dig a grave. And the ground is frozen solid. There's just no going. And we blew a hole in the ground. And then we went off with Gene's tractor, and we found this incredible slab of sandstone. And we buried Bear on top of this hilltop. And over the top of Bear is this incredible, beautiful piece of sandstone.
Nathan, I think your story just very well illustrated the mentality why people build these things, right? You just explained it. You love somebody, you care about somebody, you think they're worthy, even if it's your dog, right? So you want to place them somewhere prominent where they will have the view of the surrounding areas that they loved. You want to mark their resting place with something that you will remember and other people will notice, right? You want to make sure that their remains are safe in the ground. I mean, all these efforts you guys went through, that's right there is a perfect illustration to all the people who wonder what the magical reasons was for building these dolmens. Well, thank you, Nathan. You just pretty much gave them all in a nutshell. Yep. All right, guys.
Well, I just want to say one thing. I'll be very concise, but yes, Nathan, I can understand that quite well. We didn't go through that much trouble. We didn't go to that level, but we did haul a big chunk of stone, and it was probably out of the same type of ritualistic, and it was a family thing, but it was also a community thing, so it does relate. But let's talk about that again. Take a rain check.
And I will talk about my canary burial because it's not very megalithic, but it was also, I mean, it's still there. The spot is still marked, and it was back in 1986. Anyway, so we will share our interesting pet burial stories as we talk about the North epic cycle of stories of the Caucasian peoples next time. Guys, thank you, everyone, and I will see you in 2 weeks.
Sounds good. Everybody be well. I know I'm not on video today, but it's great to see everybody, and it's great to see you also, especially Julie. I hope that you are well. Take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
That exist within every man's soul. And we will live forever, or as long as stories are told. We are the archetypes that exist within every man's soul.